The maid's daughter sat on the marble floor, clutching the broken pieces of her favorite toy, tears streaming down her cheeks. She thought she was alone, until the cold, untouchable billionaire walked in. Everyone expected him to ignore her. But what he did next, no one could have imagined. Hello family, welcome to True Life Stories. Please subscribe and leave a like for us, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones, and turn on post notifications, so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. From the top floor of the Arcturus Tower, the city sprawled out like a mechanical map. Steel veins of traffic pulsing between high-rises, blinking with the rhythm of a sleepless metropolis. Behind a wall of seamless glass, Elijah Drake stood with his hands in the pockets of a tailored navy suit, staring out at the skyline he once dreamed of conquering. Now he owned half of it. He was the kind of man who made headlines without trying. Every quarter, when his company Drake Innovix released its financials, the stock market trembled. CEOs called him the architect, some out of respect, others out of fear. His face had graced magazines, Forbes, Tech Weekly, even The Economist, but never in the same suit twice and never with a smile. Cameras could capture the structure of his jawline and the frost in his eyes, but never the man behind them. Elijah wasn't a recluse. He wasn't eccentric. He simply had no appetite for distraction. He wasn't married. He had no known siblings or living parents. There were whispers once of a fiancée from college, but no one could name her. His days began at 4:45 a.m. sharp. Black coffee, treadmill, brief scan of the Asian markets, then 47 minutes of uninterrupted meditation. By 6 o'clock, he was reviewing operations reports and scanning emails dictated in coded systems he personally created for internal security. No one in the company dared interrupt his flow. In fact, few people dared speak to him at all. His presence in the office was not one of chaos or rage. It was of immaculate silence. Conversations died as he entered a room. Interns avoided eye contact. Assistants memorized his calendar to the second. He never raised his voice because he never had to. Mistakes were addressed with surgical precision, not fury. But the effect was no less chilling. Elijah Drake was a man known for minding his business. He didn't ask about your weekend. He didn't acknowledge birthdays, not even his own. Company parties were held without him. He never commented on fashion, never complimented a haircut, never made casual jokes. If he asked how someone was doing, it was because their productivity had changed. In the privacy of his penthouse, a 7,000-square-foot architectural wonder of glass and black marble, there were no photos on the walls, no childhood mementos, no clutter. Only art, abstract, emotionless, expensive. His library was full of biographies, economic analyses, and books on behavioral psychology. Not a single novel. Even the staff who worked in his home had their roles carved in stone. His cook, his driver, his private security detail, and his housekeeper, Marta, all moved like ghosts in the shadows of his world. He never yelled at them. He never praised them either. Once, Marta sneezed while cleaning the kitchen and froze in horror, only to hear the distant sound of his study door closing. She never knew if he heard or if he simply chose not to react. People called him cold, but that wasn't accurate. He wasn't cruel, and he wasn't detached from reality. He was simply efficient. Emotion, in his view, was a tax, an expensive, unpredictable cost that people carried like rust in their gears. He chose to operate differently. But even machines have origins. And somewhere, long buried beneath the spreadsheets, board meetings, and polished routines, there had once been a boy who liked to build toy engines and take apart radios. A boy who once laughed freely and believed in birthdays. A boy who believed in people. That boy had vanished long ago. Or so Elijah thought. Until a 6-year-old girl with tear-filled eyes and a broken toy would walk into his life. And without knowing it, invite that buried part of him back into the light. But that chapter hadn't begun yet. Not here. Not while the empire still ruled the man. The morning began like any other in the Drake penthouse. Sterile, efficient, and quiet. Sunlight filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting pale streaks of gold across the polished stone floors. Marta arrived precisely at 7 a.m., as she had for the last 6 years, her steps careful, her expression composed, her uniform spotless. But today something was different. Her heart pounded faster. Her eyes darted more frequently toward the guest bedroom. And for the first time in all her years of working for Mr. Elijah Drake, she was afraid. She wasn't afraid of punishment. Elijah wasn't the type to yell or throw things. His discipline came in silence, in unreadable gazes and disappearing contracts. One mistake could mean a door quietly closing behind you. Marta had heard the stories. A driver replaced without explanation. A chef reassigned. No one knew why, and no one dared ask. This morning, it wasn't her cleaning or performance that made her anxious. It was her daughter. 6-year-old Lillian had never been inside the penthouse before. She had always stayed with Marta's neighbor while her mother worked long, silent hours in the echoing halls of Elijah's sanctuary. But today that arrangement had collapsed. At 6:10 a.m., Marta's phone lit up with a message. Emergency. Can't watch Lillian today. I'm so sorry. Panic. Quitting wasn't an option. Marta relied on this job. The salary, though quiet and without benefits, was generous compared to anything else she could find. She couldn't afford to anger Mr. Drake, not over something personal. So, with trembling hands, she bundled Lillian into a coat, packed her a quiet toy and a small snack, and gave her the most serious talk a 6-year-old could be expected to understand. You cannot speak. You cannot wander. You must stay in this room. Play quietly, okay? Just for a few hours. Mommy will finish cleaning, and then we'll go home. Lillian, ever the quiet child, nodded solemnly. She wasn't one for tantrums or trouble. She clutched her small music box, a chipped but cherished ballerina that spun to a lullaby tune, and walked into the guest room without complaint. Still, Marta's stomach knotted. She had done the unthinkable, brought her child into Mr. Drake's world. As she moved from room to room with her cleaning supplies, damp cloth in one hand, gloves on the other, she listened for any sound. The penthouse felt cavernous. Every step echoed. She dusted the sculpture near the glass wall, wiped fingerprints from the fridge that no one used but her, and vacuumed the rugs in straight, silent lines. Her ears remained tuned to the faintest sound, hoping to hear nothing at all. Mr. Drake was supposed to be in meetings all afternoon. She had triple-checked the staff schedule. But hope wasn't certainty. Every time she passed the hallway that led to the guest room, she slowed her pace. She considered knocking, just to make sure Lillian was okay. But she couldn't draw attention to it. A single misstep in this place was like shouting into a courtroom. She remembered the day she was hired. The agency told her one thing above all else: never bring personal life into the penthouse. Elijah Drake paid for silence, discretion, and invisibility. It was unspoken, but it was law. Yet here she was, with her daughter sitting just one hallway away, behind a closed door, next to a toy that would soon change everything. Lillian sat cross-legged on the plush carpet of the guest bedroom, her tiny fingers fiddling with the small key at the bottom of her favorite toy, a porcelain ballerina encased in a plastic, egg-shaped music box. It was the only item in the room that didn't gleam with money. The walls were pristine white, the bed tucked like a showroom piece, and the furniture looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a home. But Lillian didn't care about the cold elegance of her surroundings. Her world existed in the soft hum of the lullaby the ballerina played. It was old. The ballerina's paint had chipped on the skirt, and the key often stuck when turning. But the music box had been her grandmother's, and it made her feel safe, grounded. She would twist the key, press her ear to the side, and hum along with a slightly off-key tune. It didn't matter that it was imperfect. It was hers. She had promised her mother to stay quiet, to be still. And she had been. For over an hour, she had sat quietly on the rug, her small backpack next to her, sipping water from a sippy cup and humming softly. She turned the key once more, careful and slow. It clicked. The ballerina spun lazily in her faded tutu, arms frozen in a pirouette. The melody started, but midway through something shifted. A metallic screech. Then a sudden pop. And silence. The ballerina stopped spinning. Lillian blinked. She turned the key again. Nothing. She flipped the box upside down and shook it gently. Still nothing. Her hands started moving faster. She turned the key harder this time. A snap echoed softly in the quiet room. The ballerina's arm fell off. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. The silence around her was crushing. She looked down at the toy in her lap, the one thing that had always been with her, and saw a fracture running along the plastic casing. Her eyes filled with tears instantly. Not loud sobs, not yet. Just the heavy, slow build of heartbreak swelling behind her chest. She clutched the ballerina to her chest as if that could fix it. Maybe if she held it tight enough, the arm would go back on. Maybe if she didn't look at it, it wouldn't be broken. But reality was sharp and cruel in that moment. A hiccup escaped her lips, followed by a gasp. Then the crying began. Soft at first. A kind of whimpering sob that sounded like she was trying not to cry. She buried her face in her hands, cheeks hot, her breath hitching. She didn't want to be loud. She remembered what her mother had said. Be quiet. Be good. But how could she? Her chest ached. Her face was wet. Her small body trembled as she rocked back and forth, the broken ballerina cradled like a wounded pet. "Please don't be broken," she whispered through her sobs. "Please." Down the hall, her voice carried, faint and uncertain. The penthouse, silent as a chapel, heard her. She didn't know that at that exact moment, Mr. Drake was stepping into his home early for the first time in months. The front door opened with a soft mechanical hiss. He didn't announce himself. He never did. He placed his phone on the marble counter, slipped out of his jacket, and was about to make his way to the study when he heard it. A cry. It didn't fit. There was no television on. No radio. No staff talking. No meetings today. Just the unmistakable, unfiltered sound of a child crying from somewhere deeper in his home. Elijah froze. He didn't believe in surprises. He hated them. And yet there it was again. A sniffle. A broken sob. His instincts told him to ignore it. He was already in work mode, halfway through drafting a reply in his mind to a Singapore investor. But the sound interrupted that flow like a glitch in his perfect program. Unusual things bothered him. Crying children were not in his equation. He moved slowly toward the source of the noise. His footsteps echoed softly on the marble floors. Outside the guest room, he paused. The crying was clearer now, muffled but real. High-pitched and raw. He touched the doorknob. It wasn't locked. He opened the door. And there, on the floor of his guest room, in the middle of a sea of white luxury, sat a tiny girl with tangled hair, red cheeks, and trembling hands clutching a broken toy. Her tears streaked her face in rivers. She didn't notice him at first. She was too deep in grief, whispering to the toy as if it were alive. Elijah didn't speak. Not yet. His mind tried to process the scene. Why was there a child in his house? Who let her in? Where was Marta? But something in the girl's posture, the heartbreak in her small, shaking shoulders, silenced the analyst in his brain. He didn't call security. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, Elijah Drake, one of the most private, composed men in the city, did something entirely out of character. He stepped into the room, walked across the thick carpet, and lowered himself to the floor. Slowly, deliberately, he sat beside her. On the rug, at her level. The crying softened for a moment as Lillian glanced up through wet lashes. She looked at the man beside her, tall, crisp, and expressionless, but something in his eyes made her pause. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low, almost reluctant. Lillian hiccuped, held up the broken ballerina. She's broken." Elijah took the toy gently, inspecting it. The crack was clean. The arm had snapped off. The mechanism had jammed completely. "She was your favorite?" he asked. Lillian nodded, wiping her nose on her sleeve. He handed the toy back to her carefully, almost respectfully. "I see," he said, almost to himself. Then he looked at her and added, "That's a very good reason to cry." Lillian blinked. No one had ever said that to her before. Not even her mother. Elijah Drake sat on the floor of his own guest bedroom, his spine rigid against the unfamiliar sensation of plush carpet beneath him. He wasn't a man who sat anywhere that wasn't built for purpose: a leather executive chair, the back seat of his town car, the hard bench of a rowing machine. But now, without instruction, without plan, he found himself cross-legged beside a 6-year-old girl, a broken toy between them, and silence thick in the air. He didn't speak right away. He didn't know how to. There were no scripts for this, no strategy decks, no analyst reports, no meeting agenda. Just a child with tears still drying on her cheeks, and a porcelain ballerina missing an arm. She had stopped crying now, mostly. Her sobs had shrunk into small, shuddering breaths. But her body was still curled in on itself, protectively, like a small animal unsure if the world was still dangerous. Elijah studied her in the way he studied market fluctuations. Carefully, calculatingly, but without cruelty. She had a quietness about her, the kind that wasn't born from shyness, but from restraint. She wasn't loud even when crying. She wasn't dramatic. She was heartbreak in miniature. "Do you know her name?" he asked, pointing gently to the ballerina in her lap. Lillian looked at him, startled. Her lips parted slightly, unsure if she was allowed to speak to this man. This stranger with the voice like smooth stone and eyes like winter skies. "She doesn't have one," Lillian said, almost a whisper. Elijah nodded slowly, considering this. "Maybe that's why she broke," he said after a pause. "Sometimes things fall apart when no one sees them." Lillian's eyes widened a little, not quite understanding the depth of his words, but feeling their weight. She clutched the music box closer to her chest. "I didn't mean to break her," she murmured. "I believe you," Elijah replied. He meant it. The strange thing was, he hadn't meant to say any of this. These words didn't come from the man who ran board meetings with military precision. These were the words of someone else, someone he barely remembered. Someone softer. A boy who once glued his mother's guardian angel statue back together when he knocked it over with a soccer ball. She never noticed the crack, only the effort. That memory surfaced for the first time in years. It knocked softly at the walls Elijah had spent decades building. Lillian wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She didn't smile yet, but her sobs had become steady breaths. Her small frame relaxed just enough to sit upright again. Elijah leaned back on one arm, his other hand still resting near the broken toy. "Would you like me to see if someone can fix her?" he asked. She looked up sharply. "Really? I know a few people who are good with delicate things." Lillian's face softened. "Okay." Another silence settled, but this one wasn't heavy. It was tentative, like two people standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. Elijah glanced around the room, suddenly aware of its sterility. A guest bedroom designed for form, not function. White walls, gray linens, chrome furniture. No color. No warmth. A space that looked perfect in photos, but never invited anyone to stay. The girl didn't belong in this world, and yet she had somehow brought something into it that he hadn't realized was missing. He studied her again. She wasn't intimidated by him anymore. Not exactly. But she was cautious. That he understood. He lived his entire life in caution. "What's your name?" he asked her finally. "Lillian," she replied. "What's yours?" He almost smiled. "Almost." "Elijah." She tilted her head. "That's a nice name." No one had said that to him since he was a child. Before he could respond, a sound came from the hallway. Light footsteps, rushing, but hesitant. Then a sharp inhale. A voice. One he knew. "Mr. Drake?" He turned toward the doorway. Marta stood frozen, one hand pressed against the doorframe. Her face was pale, her lips parted in horror, her other hand gripping a cleaning cloth so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Elijah looked at her blankly. He didn't rise. He didn't scold. "She broke her toy," he said simply, gesturing to Lillian. It meant a lot to her. Marta's eyes flicked from her daughter to her employer. She was clearly bracing for punishment. Termination. Cold words. Cold eyes. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I'm so sorry, sir. There was no one to watch her." I know this is unacceptable. She was very quiet, Elijah interrupted. Marta stopped mid-breath. She didn't disturb anything, he added. It wasn't approval, not exactly. But it wasn't condemnation either. He stood slowly, his long limbs unfolding with quiet authority. He didn't look down at Marta, nor did he issue an order. He simply nodded to Lillian once more, then turned and walked out of the room. No raised voice. No warning. No punishment. Just that one sentence still echoing behind him. It meant a lot to her. Marta stood frozen for several seconds. Her daughter looked up at her with wide eyes, the broken ballerina in her lap, her face still puffy from tears, but calmer now. "Mommy," Lillian said softly. "He said he's going to help fix her." Marta crouched down, wrapping her daughter in a tight, trembling hug. Her mind spun with disbelief, confusion, and a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Gratitude. Yes, but something more surprising. Hope. Something had just shifted. Not just in the air. Not just in the silence Mr. Drake left behind. But in him. Marta had spent nearly every working day of the past 6 years in the Drake penthouse. Yet nothing, not one single moment in that time, had prepared her for the sight she had just witnessed. The doorframe felt like a wall she couldn't quite step past. Her knees locked. Her lungs forgot how to breathe. Her mind scrambled to make sense of the image still fresh in her eyes. Elijah Drake, sitting, on the floor, next to her child. And not just sitting, speaking gently, engaging. He had lowered himself from his clean, cold heights to meet her daughter on the carpet of a room he barely allowed shoes to touch. The man who hadn't so much as said good morning in years had sat beside Lillian like an uncle or, no, Marta dared not think the word, like family. She had always known where she stood in this place. Invisible, functional, replaceable. She was the maid, nothing more. That suited her fine. She didn't want attention. In this house, attention was dangerous. It meant scrutiny. Marta did her job in quiet excellence and left without a trace, never once expecting kindness, let alone connection. And yet, there he had been, beside Lillian, talking to her about a broken toy like it mattered. She remembered the last time her daughter had cried that hard. It was 2 years ago, at her grandmother's funeral. Lillian wasn't a dramatic child. She held things in. But the music box had meant the world to her, passed down from the very woman they'd buried. Marta had told her not to bring it today. Too risky, she'd warned, too fragile. But Lillian had slipped it into her bag anyway, and now it was broken. And somehow that brokenness had torn open a part of Mr. Drake that no one had seen before. She replayed his words again in her mind. She broke her toy. It meant a lot to her. So simple. So human. By the time Marta found her voice, he had already stood and left the room. No fury, no icy stare, no mention of disciplinary action. Just that one line, as if it explained everything. She finally moved, legs stiff, stepping fully into the room. Her eyes fell on Lillian, still curled up on the carpet, holding the music box close. The broken ballerina's arm was tucked carefully beside the base, as if Lillian believed it might reattach itself if she wished hard enough. Marta knelt beside her, brushing the damp strands of hair from her daughter's flushed forehead. "Are you okay, Mija?" she asked softly. Lillian nodded. "He said it's okay that I cried." Marta's breath caught in her throat. "He said sometimes things break when no one sees them," Lillian added thoughtfully, the words carrying more weight than they should have for a child her age. Marta could feel the sting of tears rise, but she blinked them back. She had to remain composed, for Lillian's sake and her own. There was still the matter of what this meant for her job. Would he change his mind later? Would he send a message through his assistant, terminating her contract with a cold but professional statement about inappropriate boundaries? She almost rose then and marched straight to his study to apologize, to explain herself, to beg if she had to. But something held her back. A tone in his voice. A softness she'd never heard before. It wasn't pity. It wasn't annoyance. It was something quieter, recognition perhaps. As though he had seen something in Lillian's grief that reflected something in himself. Marta remained kneeling, wrapping her arms around her daughter. "You didn't do anything wrong, Lillian," she said gently. "I broke her," Lillian replied, eyes downcast. "We all break things sometimes," Marta said. "But not everyone tries to understand why." Lillian leaned into her tiny body warm and trembling from the leftover storm of emotion. Marta kissed the top of her head, and they sat there in silence for a while. The penthouse had returned to its usual quiet, but now that silence felt different. Less sterile. It wasn't the kind of silence that demanded obedience anymore. It was the quiet that followed a conversation, not the kind that preceded judgment. Eventually, Marta stood and guided Lillian back into the guest room bed, tucking her under the crisp white sheets. Lillian held the music box to her chest like a stuffed animal and closed her eyes, finally exhausted enough to rest. Marta turned off the light and closed the door gently behind her. As she stepped back into the hallway, she paused, her gaze drifting toward the study door at the far end, the one Mr. Drake had retreated into. The door was closed, as it always was. But something behind it had changed. She could feel it. Whatever happened next, this day had rewritten something fundamental in the structure of this home, and perhaps in the man who ruled over it. 3 days had passed. Marta had come to work each morning with a tight chest and a stomach full of silent worry. Despite the seemingly gentle way Mr. Drake had handled Lillian's presence and the broken toy, Marta could not forget who he was. Elijah Drake didn't forget. He didn't make exceptions. He didn't get personal. She had not spoken to him since that day. He hadn't mentioned Lillian. Not a word. No message through his assistant. No formal reprimand. But his silence was louder than usual. It lingered in the halls of the penthouse like a question that hadn't yet been answered. Marta worked quietly, head down, ears tuned for any signal of what might come. But everything felt unchanged. He still worked behind the closed door of his study. Still emerged at 12:01 p.m. for his precisely plated lunch. Still returned his coffee to the kitchen with the spoon aligned perfectly across the rim. And yet, there was a subtle shift. She couldn't explain it exactly, but she felt it. Maybe it was the way he paused a moment longer before going back into his study. Or the way he glanced, just briefly, at the hallway where Lillian had cried. She wondered if he was thinking about the toy. About the child who'd looked at him like he was something more than a shadow in a suit. Then, on Friday morning, a package arrived. It was hand-delivered, not by courier, but by a man in a pressed suit with an embossed label clipped to his chest. Marta opened the door and signed for it, confused. There was no sender name, no return address. Just a white box, simple and elegant, wrapped with a dark navy ribbon. It looked expensive, carefully chosen. She set it on the kitchen counter and stared at it, wondering who it was for. She didn't touch it. Mr. Drake didn't like staff handling personal deliveries. But before she could step away, she saw it. A small ivory tag tied into the ribbon. 2 words in tidy, angular handwriting. For Lillian. Her breath caught. For a moment, she simply stood there, unmoving. Then, cautiously, she undid the ribbon and opened the box. Inside, nestled in velvet lining, was the ballerina, or rather a ballerina. Nearly identical to Lillian's, but flawless. The same soft pink tutu, the same pearl-white porcelain limbs, the same delicate gold key. Except this one wasn't aged or chipped. It was new, or perhaps restored. She lifted it gently. It was heavy, solid, real. Next to it was a folded note, plain cream cardstock. Marta opened it, and inside were just 2 lines written in the same firm hand. Hope this helps bring the music back. That was it. No signature beyond that single letter. No instructions. No formalities. Just a gift, an act of compassion that felt almost unreal. Marta blinked back a wave of emotion. She carefully repacked the box and, when her shift ended, took it home to Lillian. The little girl gasped when she saw it. "You found her," she cried. "You fixed her." Marta shook her head slowly. "No, Mija. Mr. Drake did." Lillian's eyes widened, her fingers trembling as she opened the box. She wound the key slowly, breathless. The soft melody began to play, delicate and full, every note perfect. The ballerina spun in place, arms raised, no cracks, no missing pieces. Lillian stared at her in awe, then pressed the music box gently against her ear. Marta watched her daughter's face bloom into the kind of joy only a child could express fully, with no pretense, no skepticism. Just pure wonder. "Can I thank him?" Lillian asked. Marta smiled, brushing her daughter's hair from her face. "I think you already did." The next Monday, things felt different. Elijah emerged from his study earlier than usual. Not by much. 5 minutes, maybe. But Marta noticed. He walked into the kitchen just as she was drying the dishes. "You gave her the package?" he asked without preamble. Marta turned, caught off guard. His voice was calm, neutral, but not cold. "I did," she said carefully. She loved it. It meant a lot to her. He nodded once, then paused. "She named the new one," Marta added. Elijah's brows lifted slightly. "Did she?" "She calls her Hope." There was a pause between them, brief but heavy with unspoken things. Elijah's gaze dropped, just for a moment, to the corner of the kitchen where Lillian had once peeked out in wide-eyed wonder. Then he looked back at Marta. "She's a smart girl," he said. Marta gave a small smile. "She is." He nodded again, slower this time, and turned to leave. But halfway to the hallway, he stopped. "I'll be in the sitting room today," he said. That was unusual. He never worked in the sitting room. It was a social space, open with couches and large windows, too much light for someone who preferred the privacy of dark wood and frosted glass. Marta didn't respond. She only returned to her work, puzzled but silent. An hour later, she passed the sitting room and glanced in. Elijah was there. Laptop open, files spread out across the coffee table. But he wasn't focused. He kept looking toward the hallway, waiting, hoping, perhaps, that the girl with the broken ballerina would return. The penthouse had changed. Not outwardly, at least not in the ways that most would notice. The marble still gleamed. The furniture still whispered wealth and taste. The massive windows still cast reflections across silent floors. But there was a new texture in the space now. A warmth that wasn't from sunlight or lighting or curated interiors. Something had softened in the walls, and in the man who lived within them. Elijah Drake had not reverted to old habits, not entirely. He still worked obsessively, still demanded precision, still rose before dawn and ran his company with the same meticulous force that had built it. But the edges of him, the ones people avoided, had dulled in ways that were difficult to explain and impossible to ignore. And it all began with a child's tears and a broken toy. He never told Marta outright that Lillian was welcome back. He didn't need to. The next time her sitter canceled, Marta called in advance, her voice low and cautious, explaining the situation. She offered to make up her hours another day, to clean during the night if necessary. But all Elijah said was, "Bring her." So Lillian returned, this time with permission. And he noticed something. She didn't treat him like he was made of glass. She didn't flinch when he walked into a room. She didn't wait for him to speak first. She greeted him with that small, serious smile and held up whatever book or toy she'd brought like an offering of trust. It disarmed him. No one else in his life had ever approached him that way. With reverence, yes, but never with openness. Sometimes, when Marta was busy dusting the upper floors or ironing the day's laundry, Lillian would sit on the floor near the large window of the sitting room with her new ballerina, Hope, dancing to the same melody again and again. Elijah would work nearby, not always speaking, not always watching, but never leaving. And sometimes she would speak. One afternoon, she asked him why he didn't have any pets. "Because I'm rarely home," he replied without looking up. She considered that. "You're home now." He glanced at her then. She wasn't smiling. She was just telling the truth. Like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Another day, she asked why his house didn't have any photos. "I don't like clutter," he said. "But pictures aren't clutter," she said. "They're memories." He didn't have an answer for that. He found himself searching for one long after she had returned to her coloring. Then came the day that shifted everything, though it started simply, like most meaningful days do. It was a Saturday. Marta had to come in for extra hours before a large corporate dinner being hosted in the penthouse. She brought Lillian with her again, not wanting to leave her with neighbors until late. She planned to keep her tucked away in the guest room, like before. But when Elijah saw them enter together, he didn't retreat into his study. Instead, he turned to Lillian and said, "There's cake in the kitchen." Lillian blinked. "For me?" He paused. "It's leftover." "But yes." Marta's eyes widened slightly. He didn't eat cake. He didn't have cake. But sure enough, there it was, a small box from a high-end bakery resting neatly on the counter. Inside were 4 pastel cupcakes, delicate and perfect. One had a tiny pink sugar ballerina on top. Lillian picked it up as if it were made of crystal. "Can I eat it now?" "Why not?" he said, already turning away, but slower this time waiting. She ate the cupcake sitting on one of the bar stools, legs swinging under the counter, humming the melody of her music box softly to herself. Marta didn't speak. She just kept watching, and something in her heart, a door long sealed, began to open. From then on, things unfolded gently. Week by week, layer by layer. Elijah started keeping juice boxes in the fridge. Then came the day he printed a coloring sheet from his office printer and left it on the table with a set of markers beside it. He never admitted it was for Lillian, but no one else colored in that house. Later, he set up a simple tablet with a few educational games. When Lillian saw it, her eyes lit up. He found himself sitting with her sometimes, not for long, but long enough to answer questions. He showed her how to sort patterns, how to match rhythms. One day, she asked what code was, and instead of brushing her off, he opened his laptop and showed her a simple loop. "You're making the computer listen to you," he explained. She was captivated. When she drew a picture of a ballerina dancing on a stage, she handed it to him like a treasure. Elijah framed it, put it on the wall in his study. No one had ever seen art on those walls before, not even him. On Lillian's 7th birthday, Marta didn't bring her to work. She took the day off instead, planning something small, balloons, maybe a cupcake at home. But that morning, a car pulled up outside her building. A sleek black sedan with tinted windows. The driver stepped out and handed her an envelope. No words, just a slight bow. Inside was a note. "If she's available today, I'd like to see her. E." Below the note was an address. Marta had never seen it before. It wasn't the penthouse. It was a small space on the Upper West Side, one of the private event suites Elijah kept under another name. A quiet, elegant place. When she arrived with Lillian, she expected coldness. Formality. A strange gesture from a man who didn't understand children. What she found was a room filled with soft pink balloons, a table set for 3, and a birthday cake shaped like a spinning ballerina. Lillian gasped. Elijah stood at the far end of the room, uncomfortable, hands in his pockets. No tie. A light blue shirt instead of his usual white. He didn't say much, but when Lillian ran up and hugged him, he didn't flinch. He placed one hand on her back. Awkward, but sincere. They ate cake. Lillian opened a book about computers wrapped in silver paper. Marta tried not to cry. No photographers. No press. No grand announcements. Just 3 people at a table. Something that looked a lot like family. It didn't happen overnight, the change. But over time, people began to notice. Elijah smiled more. Not often, but enough. He asked after Marta's day. He came home earlier. Sometimes, he invited them to stay a little longer. Just for dinner. Just for a walk on the rooftop garden. Just to be there. People in his company began whispering. He seems different. Clients noticed. Is he happier? There were no answers. No explanations. Just a quiet truth known only to 3 people. A broken ballerina had cracked something open. And through that crack, something warm had come in. Not disruption. Not chaos. Family. Unexpected. Unlikely. But real. We have come to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories.